Hello, it's Greg Emerson once again coming from the Australian outback. Just remember, in the beginning there was light, water, circadian rhythms and the energy that created them all. Think about that for a minute while I'm trying to get rid of some of these flies. Now today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about two scientific papers. Well, an amalgamation of papers really about two subjects. The first subject is a discussion of heat shock proteins and their role in degenerative brain disease, particularly Alzheimer's disease. And the second subject is a reference to last week's discussion about tumour infiltrating lymphocytes and their role in cancer. But first, I have to get rid of the legal disclaimer, which means that, one, this is not health or medical advice. This video is purely for educational and entertainment purposes, and mainly educational because I'm not very funny, not very entertaining. I'm a pretty good biohacker, but not funny. And this video certainly does not replace a professional relationship with your own medical or health practitioner. You have to remember, after 6 years, I continue to be suspended in nutritional environmental medicine. I can only practice as an emergency medicine specialist in the hospital. So do not, I repeat, do not take any of this as medical advice. And just because I go jumping in extremely hot environments and cold water, don't do that without getting some advice either. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, which is about heat shock proteins and degenerative brain disease. Now, before I go and discuss that, I've got to get a couple of facts out of the way. First fact is our cells produce light. That light is called biophotons, and that comes from the mitochondria, as we discussed last week. So mitochondria produce energy as ATP, they produce exhaust as in free radicals, they produce heat, they produce light as biophotons, and they produce water. And that light that it produces is called biophotons. And what we know now is that the more stress the cell is under, the more light it produces. In fact, at the time of the death, the light becomes the highest ever. It's almost like that light which our cells use to communicate with each other. We're not just using hormones and chemicals for cellular communication. Know that we're using biophotonic light, which is electromagnetic radiation, not just chemical communication with hormones and neurotransmitters. So we produce a lot of light, like the light is trying to protect the cells. Now the other thing that we use to protect ourselves is heat shock proteins. So to understand heat shock proteins, we have to understand proteins. Proteins are a collection of amino acids which are put together in particular shapes. And those shapes can become deformed if they're stressed. It's kind of like using bricks to put a house together, but the bricks are all different shapes. And so they have to be put together perfectly for the house to be built properly. Now, if those bricks are malformed or misshaped, the whole house falls apart. So what the heat shock proteins do is when proteins have been constructed, the heat shock proteins help construct the proteins so they're in the correct shape. If they're not in the correct shape, the second role of the heat shock protein is to try and rebend them into the right place. And the third role of the heat shock proteins is that if the proteins can't be repaired and they're not fitting together properly, then those proteins are destroyed. So in summary, the heat shock proteins fold the amino acids together properly to form correct proteins. If they're not folded together, they basically tear them apart and reconstruct them so they are proper. And if that's unsuccessful, then they use apoptosis to kill the cells with the proteins in it. It's a bit like somebody told me once there was this dude called Moses who was kind of a prince, and then he got a bit too arrogant and got put out in the desert for 40 years. kind of got deconstructed, deformed, and then reformed into a completely different person, different personality with different priorities. And that's kind of what heat shock proteins do. They pull apart the deformed proteins and put them back together again. Now, the more stress we're under, particularly environmental stress with cold and heat, the more heat shock proteins that we produce to try and prevent damage to our proteins. So if we're under extreme heat pressure in a sauna, or like I am now out here under more fly pressure than heat pressure, the proteins will start to get deformed or molded or bent, and the heat shock proteins will be increased, trying to reform those proteins into the correct shape rather than the deformed shape. And if they're not successful, then the heat shock proteins will get rid of those cells through apoptosis to clean up the proteins as much as possible. Right, now chapter 2 of this book, of this discussion on degenerative brain disease, both of which my parents died of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, the statistics are now that 55 million people around the world have Alzheimer's disease, and they say by 2050 that one person will be developing Alzheimer's disease every 33 seconds. Now, this next chapter is on the emerging evidence, which is now profound, and hundreds of studies on this, about the role of persistent herpes simplex virus in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, what they've found is the traditional pathology of Alzheimer's disease has been protein plaques in the brain called tau protein and amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangles. But what they've discovered now is particularly the tau protein is antiviral. So there's a big theory now which says that the amyloid and the tau proteins, which are antiviral, are there trying to protect the cells from the viral burden, and it's only when they become overwhelmed that the protein becomes pathological and loses its preventative function. So it starts off trying to protect the brain, but after the brain loses the fight, the proteins start to become harmful. And it's a bit like that with heat shock proteins, and that's where heat shock proteins come into the story. And the heat shock proteins as well try and protect the cells by reforming their proteins in the correct shape. And it's only when the heat shock proteins and the tau fail because the burden is too high that the disease becomes manifest. So that's a couple of reasons why I try and keep my immune system as strong as possible, because I want to keep any burden of any persistent viruses in my body down as low as possible. We can have a discussion one day about why the herpes virus might persist in the brain. That's another discussion. But I try and keep my immune system as strong as possible, and I probably have 5 or 6 saunas a week now, like honouring my Viking heritage, to increase my heat shock proteins so that I maximise the repair of any damaged proteins in my brain. Because what happens, as we said, once that system fails, then the heat shock proteins start to destroy the brain cells. So that's what's happening in these neurodegenerative brain diseases. There's an insult, which many think is a herpes virus, which causes accumulation of these abnormal proteins in the brain. Then the tau protein comes along, tries to correct it. Heat shock proteins come along and try and correct it. And when they fail, we start to lose brain cells through apoptosis. When the heat shock proteins start to break down, flies, the cells which can no longer be repaired. So that's kind of long and complicated, particularly because it's all very new science. But I'll put on at the end the references in the description of the YouTube video, and I'll put a screenshot in the video so people can go and read the studies themselves. And I'll put on a summary slide on what I've just discussed. Right, the last thing I want to discuss, this lake is just stunning, but holy hell, the flies. Last thing I want to discuss is a reference to last week's discussion on mitophagy and its role in cancer, because there's been some new interesting information now out about what we discussed last week, which was the tumour infiltrating lymphocytes, the white cells of our body which kill cancer cells. And there's a study, which again I'll put on the end of this, well no, it's not a study, it's a paper from Cleveland Health Clinic, where they're now using tumour infiltrating lymphocytes in cancer treatment. And this paper was about the use in melanoma, where traditional treatment with immunotherapy was failing, and they're now using tumour infiltrating lymphocytes. And what they do with tumour infiltrating lymphocytes is they take some of the cancer out of the patient, and then they harvest the tumour infiltrating lymphocytes from the cancer, take them out of the body, grow lots of them, put them back in the body after they've had some chemotherapy, and then those tumour infiltrating cells, which kill cancer cells, but the Cleveland Health Clinic says that there's just not enough of them, and the tumour infiltrating cells in much higher numbers kill the cancer cells, and they've had really good results from that. And they do say that the tumour infiltrating cells work best very early in cancer, when they actually use the word seeding of the cancer through its desire to persist by throwing out metastatic cells. Works very best early in the cancer. So my plan is to try and avoid any of that. So I try and maximize my mitophagy, which is where I was keeping my immune system strong, because remember we discussed last week how cancer cells inject through microtubules and vesicles their mutated DNA into the DNA of our lymphocytes. So they recruit our lymphocytes to their team, not on our team anymore. So I try and keep my lymphocytes as strong as possible so that doesn't happen. I don't want the cancer, the mutated new species in my body, taking over my defences, my macrophage, my tumour infiltrating lymphocytes. And I was doing that by my 2 C's and 3 M's. Coenzyme Q10, cold thermogenesis, melatonin, magnesium, and methylene blue. So that's what I do, not medical advice, just what this crazy Kiwi Viking does, to keep his tumour infiltrating lymphocytes as healthy as possible. Now the second paper that came out about that was some research on aspirin, and it was showing that we've known for ages that people who take regular aspirin for some reason have a much lower incidence of cancer. Now the use of aspirin has dropped down dramatically because of its known risks with stomach ulcers in particular. But the theory was that because aspirin is antiplatelet. Right, where were we? Sorry about that, bit of a mishmash, but I was about to choke on a whole swarm of very annoying flies. Decided to move away from the lake a little bit. So we're talking about aspirin and cancer, and we're talking about how the use of aspirin has declined a lot because of its risk of bleeding stomach ulcers. But we did find that while people were taking aspirin, they have a lower incidence of cancer. And we think now, because one of the ways aspirin works is by reducing platelet numbers and therefore minimising platelet-induced blood clots, particularly in heart disease. But we also know that platelets, for some reason, reduce tumour infiltrating cells. So the theory is that aspirin is working by getting rid of platelets and therefore increasing tumour infiltrating cells, which then, those tumour infiltrating cells, are the cells of our immune system, which very early in cancer, when it's first seeding is in the metastasizing process, are what killing those seeded cancer cells. All right, that was tough going today. Woo! Maybe I should sit in a blue lit studio and record these videos. No, I'm not going to do that. I want to get my sunset. and my good ear. I'll put a lot of those summaries up, and I'll end with another favourite quote. In this fact, this quote I first saw in the movie Fury with Brad Pitt and Shia LaBeouf. It's about the American tank in World War II, and they're in their last standoff against insurmountable odds. And Shia LaBeouf plays a guy whose nickname is Bible because he's always quoting from the Bible. And they're all pretty sure of what the end result is going to be because the odds are so overwhelming. But they decide that they're going to stay and fight anyway. It's a very powerful movie. And so Shia LaBeouf, playing the character Bible, is sitting in the tank with the others, and he says, there's a quote he thinks about all the time, many times, and the quote is, "And then I heard the voice of the Lord say, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me.'" And it just really helps me kind of understand that sometimes we have to stand up, fight for what we think is right. And today I've successfully fought off hordes of flies and probably a few brown snakes. So thanks for watching. Peace and love. Love you all. Heart and thoughts go out to the people of northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland, copping an absolute drenching with the cyclone. I live in northern New South Wales now because it reminds me of New Zealand, where I'm from. Oceans, rainforest and rivers. So hope you enjoyed today's video. Put up some summaries. Remember, it's not medical advice, and I'll see you next week. Bye.